Hey there, and welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and turn information into insight.
Glad to be diving in.
Today, we're tackling a name you've likely heard, one that's really been central to Chicago's history and, debates about justice for decades, Larry Hoover.
A really complex figure.
Absolutely. You sent us a stack of material articles, reports on his legal battles, accounts of the constant efforts for his freedom, and our mission is to really get into that stack.
Yeah, unpack it.
We want to unpack the key moments, pull out the maybe surprising facts, and explore the complicated questions around a man who spent, well, almost his entire life behind bars. Ready?
Let's do it. This deep dive really asks us to look closely at someone who, evolved from a street gang leader into the alleged head of this massive criminal enterprise.
Right.
And his story, it touches on these huge themes in the American justice system, how gangs can operate, the power of federal racketeering laws, and the incredibly tough road of seeking clemency after decades locked up.
Okay, let's unpack this story right from the start then. Before the federal charges, before Supermax, who was Larry Hoover back in Chicago.
Yeah, the material takes us back, South Side Chicago.
Born November 1950.
And he rose up fast in the games. Co-founder of the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, partnered with David Barksdale pretty early on.
And what seems fascinating, something the sources really highlight, is how he's credited with trying to change the standard street gang model.
Right, not just street corners. He apparently tried to structure the Gangster Disciples more like a corporation.
With that growth and development name, GD.
Exactly, that facade.
And our sources are pretty clear that, while it looked community-friendly on the surface, law enforcement saw it very differently.
Oh, definitely. I saw it as basically a sophisticated cover.
A cover for what? Huge criminal operations?
Yeah, allegedly. Massive drug trafficking, extortion, violence. The structure supposedly let them build up significant wealth and influence under his purported leadership.
So it wasn't just a gang anymore. It was allegedly this multi-million-dollar business being run.
Precisely. And that shift, to a more organized, almost corporate style, that's a key insight the sources give us. It really changed how these groups operated and, frankly, how law enforcement had to investigate them.
So when did this alleged empire builder first get into really serious trouble? The kind that stuck?
Okay, that takes us back to 1973. The sources describe his conviction for the murder of William Young.
And this wasn't like a big gang war thing.
No, surprisingly, it was apparently during a dispute over a candy store. Seems small, but the consequence was enormous.
Which was?
A sentence of 150 to 200 years in state prison.
Wow. 150 to 200 years for one murder. That's an incredibly heavy sentence, even for back then.
It absolutely was. And it put him physically behind bars very early in his adult life.
Yeah.
Which, raises this really important question the sources dig into. How did he stay such a powerful figure, allegedly directing this huge criminal enterprise for decades while locked up in state prison?
That seems almost impossible. Right. How could someone locked up maintain that kind of control?
Well, this is where the federal part of the story really kicks in. The sources detail these massive, lengthy investigations.
By federal law enforcement.
Yeah. Using painstaking wiretaps, informants actually placed inside the prison system itself.
To prove he was still in charge.
To prove, allegedly, that he kept a powerful grip, continuing to command the drug trade and the wider gang operations, all from inside state custody. It took a huge multi-year effort just to document that alleged command structure.
Okay, just to ground us in the timeline again, he went in early 70s on that state sentence.
Oh.
How old is Larry Hoover now?
The sources note he just turned 74, November 30, 2024.
74. So convicted in 73. That means what, over 50 years? The vast majority of his life spent incarcerated.
Yeah, it really puts the scale of this whole thing into perspective.
Okay, so he's in state prison, serving that incredibly long sentence, but his legal troubles weren't finished. The federal government decides to step in. Why? Why target someone already serving 150 plus years?
Because from the federal viewpoint laid out in the sources, he wasn't just someone serving time. He was allegedly still the active head of this sprawling criminal enterprise.
Even behind bars.
Even behind bars. So despite being physically off the streets, he was still a major target for federal law enforcement who wanted to completely dismantle that organization.
And this leads to that big federal investigation in the early 90s you mentioned.
That's the one, nicknamed Operation Headache. Kind of tells you something right there.
Yeah.
And if you connect the dots, the federal case wasn't just about his past crimes. It was specifically aimed at proving he was running a large-scale criminal operation. We're talking drug trafficking, money laundering from inside the state prison system.
So the feds essentially went after him for what he was allegedly doing while he was already locked up. What were the specific Larry Hoover charges at the federal level from Operation Headache?
Okay, so in 1995, he gets indicted by the feds. The charges were heavy hitters, engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise.
Okay, pause there. Continuing criminal enterprise. That sounds like a specific legal term. What does that actually entail?
It is, yeah, CCE, sometimes called the Kingpin Statute. It's designed specifically to target the leaders, the top dogs of large-scale drug trafficking organizations.
So, like the boss.
Essentially, to prove it, the government has to show that someone got substantial income from a continuing series of serious drug offenses and that they acted as an organizer, supervisor, or manager of 5 or more other people in that enterprise.
Okay.
It's a really powerful tool for dismantling the leadership of these groups, and using it against Hoover was huge because they were alleging he met all those criteria while incarcerated.
Along with CCE, what else?
Conspiracy, extortion, and drug trafficking charges as well.
So the prosecution's aim was basically to prove he was the undisputed leader of this multi-million-dollar criminal machine, running it actively, even from his prison cell.
What happened at that federal trial in 1997?
After a federal jury trial,
Guilty.
on all the federal charges.
All of them, including the CCE charge. Yes, according to the sources, guilty across the board.
And the sentence?
Life imprisonment. Another one. A second life sentence, set to run concurrently with his existing state sentence.
A second life sentence. So that federal conviction pretty much guaranteed he'd stay locked up indefinitely no matter what happened with the state sentence.
That's right. It effectively shifted the primary authority over his custody to the federal government. And it basically slammed the door on any realistic chance of release through the state system, like parole.
And what happened immediately after that federal conviction? Where did they send him?
He was transferred out of state custody and into the federal system, specifically to a federal supermax prison, ADX Florence in Colorado.
ADX Florence.
Yeah.
That's known as, like, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, right?
Mhm.
One of the most secure prisons in the country.
Absolutely. And the sources point out this transfer wasn't random. It was a very deliberate move.
Right.
Aimed squarely at cutting off absolutely all potential communication channels he might have had with the outside world. It really reflected the government's assessment of his influence, the threat they believed he still posed, even after decades inside and now facing federal life.
So his confinement there really underscores how seriously the government viewed him.
Yeah, viewed his past crimes and his alleged, continued capacity to lead, even then.
Okay, so 2 concurrent life sentences, locked up in Supermax. That sounds like the end of the story, legally speaking.
Yeah, I think so.
But despite these, seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the efforts to get Larry Hoover freed haven't actually stopped.
No, they haven't.
This is where the story takes another twist, right?
Hmm.
Into public advocacy, even celebrity involvement.
Exactly. For years now, efforts to get him released or at least get his sentence commuted have kept going, mostly driven by his family and a network of advocates.
What are the main arguments they've been making for his release?
Well, according to the sources, the arguments usually center on claims of rehabilitation.
That he's changed.
Yeah, that he's a changed man after all these decades inside. They also argue the sentences are disproportionate, especially given his age now and the amount of time he's already served. And, the idea that keeping him incarcerated serves no real purpose anymore if he's no longer a threat.
And this push for clemency, it got a lot of national attention pretty recently, didn't it?
It really did. It blew up, actually, with the involvement of some very high-profile advocates. The artist Kanye West, who now goes by Ye,
Right.
and Kim Kardashian, who's become quite involved in criminal justice reform work.
And they didn't just talk about it, they took the case right to the top.
All the way to the White House, yeah. They met with the president at the time, Donald Trump, specifically to discuss Larry Hoover's case.
Wow.
And those meetings, they were reported everywhere. Suddenly terms like Larry Hoover pardon and Trump pardon Larry Hoover were, part of the national political conversation.
What exactly were they arguing to President Trump in those meetings, based on the sources?
Reports indicate they focused heavily on Hoover's claim of reformation, that he was no longer involved in gang activity. The pitch was really centered on rehabilitation, restorative justice, and making a case for leniency based on the sheer amount of time served and his alleged change in character.
But these efforts They weren't happening in a vacuum. There was serious pushback.
Oh, absolutely. The sources make that very clear. There was strong resistance from law enforcement officials, the original prosecutors involved in his cases, and also victims' advocates.
And their position.
Their stance was unambiguous. They argued Hoover remained a dangerous individual. They pointed to the severity of his past crimes, the immense suffering caused, and argued his release would undermine justice and could even pose a threat to public safety. Essentially, they contended that any claims of reformation either weren't genuine or simply didn't outweigh the gravity of his convictions.
So you had these really powerful advocates pushing hard for his release, and equally determined voices arguing just as strongly against it. After all that, the meetings, the public debate, what was the final outcome? Did Trump pardon Larry Hoover?
Well, according to the sources and, public records, despite all that advocacy and the media attention, President Donald Trump did not grant a pardon, nor did he commute Larry Hoover's sentence.
Okay, so just to be crystal clear for anyone wondering, you see the questions online. Is Larry Hoover free? Is Larry Hoover out of jail? Did Trump free Larry Hoover? The definitive answer, based on everything we have and his current status today, June 2, 2025, is no.
No, he remains incarcerated.
Which brings us to right now, his status today.
As of June 2, 2025, he is still incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary, Administrative Maximum Facility ADX Florence in Florence, Colorado.
Still in the federal supermax.
Correct. And the source material really emphasizes that his continued confinement in that type of facility, a supermaximum security prison, is significant. It reflects the government's ongoing assessment of his case, whether that's based on a perception that he still has some kind of enduring influence, or simply on the extreme gravity of the crimes he was convicted for, even considering his advanced age now.
And given the life sentences, the federal one especially, and the fact that clemency wasn't granted, what does that realistically mean for his future release prospects?
Under the terms of his federal sentence, well, he's not eligible for parole.
No parole eligibility at all.
No. So his Larry Hoover release date is, for all practical purposes, indefinite. There isn't a standard path for release open to him under his current convictions and sentences.
This whole case, it really touches on these much broader, really complex themes within the American justice system, things that are relevant to all of us, really, whether you follow this specific story closely or not.
Absolutely. It forces us to ask some fundamental questions, doesn't it? Like, what is the potential for genuine rehabilitation after someone spends decades, literally decades, in prison for very severe crimes?
Right. And what's the ongoing debate about the actual purpose and maybe the appropriate length of these incredibly severe sentences, especially life sentences without parole?
And how does high-profile advocacy, celebrity involvement, actually influence or maybe fail to influence these clemency cases?
Yeah.
And maybe the biggest question, how do we as a society try to balance holding individuals accountable for truly terrible past crimes with considering the possibilities, however controversial or unlikely they might seem, for transformation or redemption later in life?
It's a real tension. For some supporters, as the sources mention, Larry Hoover's continued imprisonment, especially now at 74 in Supermax, might represent, perceived flaws in the justice system, or maybe just the idea that someone has served an extraordinarily long time.
But then for law enforcement, and importantly for many victims and their families, he remains this powerful symbol of immense suffering, and potentially because of his history and the nature of the enterprise he allegedly built, an ongoing criminal threat. That core tension between what did Larry Hoover do, the sheer severity of the charges, the convictions, and the questions raised by his age, his decades behind bars. That's really why his case keeps coming up. It keeps surfacing in public discussions, often tied to broader talks about criminal justice reform or the legacy of different presidents' approaches to pardons.
His life, as the sources seem to conclude, has been almost entirely shaped and defined by the criminal justice system itself.
Almost from start to finish.
So we've taken a deep dive today into the sources detailing the life, the very complex legal journey of Larry Hoover. From his rise as a gang leader, that initial, incredibly long state conviction.
Right, the 150, 200 years.
To the federal conviction for running an enterprise from inside prison, the high-profile campaigns for his clemency, including those appeals to the White House.
Yeah, the Trump meetings.
And his continued incarceration today in one of the country's most secure facilities.
His story really is a stark reminder, isn't it, of the long-term consequences of crime, the evolution of organized criminal activity, and these really complex societal and legal challenges around gang violence and, frankly, the realities of mass incarceration in the U.S.
And it really leaves us, and maybe you, with a powerful, kind of lingering question to think about.
Mm.
In these cases involving decades upon decades of imprisonment for very severe crimes, how do we, as a society and through our justice system, navigate that incredibly difficult balance
The balance between what?
between permanent punishment that aims to reflect the gravity of what happened and the possibility, however distant, however debated it might be, of transformation or redemption, or maybe just the sheer impact of time passing?
Yeah, that's a question without any easy answers at all. Definitely something worth mulling over.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you a clear picture of a complex figure and the intricate legal world he still inhabits.